Hello, trying to diagnose a salt cell issue. Some articles suggest a new flow switch. Some suggest recalibration of the salt cell. My salt pool is 20 by 40. We've had it for 8 years. In that time, I replaced the salt cell once. The IC40 says good flow. It says it generates chlorine, but my issue shows 0 parts per million on the salt level. I know the cell won't make chlorine if the levels are too high or too low, but all the lights are green showing chlorine is being made. 1, what can I do so the cell will show me a salt level? 2, the water is clear but getting cloudy. All right, so here's what I would do.
Replace the cell.
I would, and here's why. The lifespan of a salt cell, like a Pentair, is 10,000 hours, and I don't know why it's 10,000 hours. I can only assume it's because the components used to make it would deteriorate in that amount of time. I don't think that Pentair programs this thing so that it goes out at 10,000 hours. I think there's a reason. And if you do the math of how many hours a day you run your pool system and how many years you run it, I've done that here in Michigan with our seasonal clients. If they turn the pool on in April and they turn it off in October and they're using it 24 hours a day in between, which is what some of ours do, the lifespan, I've done the math, it's like 2.3 years of them running it before we need to replace that cell. So if you're telling me that you've replaced your cell once in 8 years,
That was assumed 4 years ago.
it's time. So you should replace it.
Well, let's think about that as well. Let's just assume 20 by 40 pool. Gunite, it's not going to be fiberglass, but gunite or vinyl. A 20 by 40 gunite pool is 30,000 gallons of water. 20 by 40 vinyl liner pool is probably 25,000 gallons of water. Well, if you have an IC40 on your pool, Pentair specific IC40, that cell needs to run for, it's designed 24 hours a day at 100% will produce enough chlorine for a 40,000 gallon pool.
Yeah.
So your system, if it's a gunite pool, would have to run 75% of the time at 100% chlorine for it to produce enough to make this work. It doesn't take long to hit that 10,000 hours of use. Yep. So likely it's just time to replace the filter. Replace the salt cell.
If you don't replace the salt cell and you try to replace just the flow switch or just the components controlling it, and other components in the cell have worn out, and if, for example, the flow registers it's on and the cell is producing but the system turns off, like there's so many other things that can go wrong in there. It can catch fire.
You'll burn them. We've seen them burn up.
It can become catastrophic. It could cause massive issues. So when you reach the expected lifetime on your equipment,
replace it. Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about electricity and salt and generating chlorine, chemicals, gas.
People don't believe it. People think, oh, these are perfectly safe, whatever. But you are literally creating chlorine gas, which is incredibly unstable. And anything that can go wrong, you're going to see it, especially at that point. You replace certain components, you're going to add a whole nother level. And again, this isn't what the pool guy that sells you the stuff typically tells you. Right. This is not the sweet girl in the store that sells you the unit to self-install. She's not going to tell you that. She's just going to tell you it's the greatest thing in the world. But the reality is we've seen the result of a fire, which will melt your equipment and potentially a whole lot of weird stuff happen. Yeah. So it's probably just time to replace that cell and you'll be all right.
If you are unsure if this is your issue, but you know that something is not right and you can't take the salt cell off because it's in the plumbing and it will drain, at least disconnect the wire that runs from the salt cell to your equipment so that you know that it does not have power
to it.
Because if you're still running water through it, even if it's old and you know that you need to do something about it, if you don't have it connected to power,
at least you're not going to have that issue.
You'll mitigate those issues and you'll buy yourself some time to deal with it. So at minimum, if it's malfunctioning, you unplug that sucker right now, like literally,
and then handle it with chlorine, liquid chlorine, and
go unplug it, because it is so unsafe. If there's a problem, do that.
Good point.
Thanks. I occasionally have a good point.
You do.
That is a good one. First-hand experience.
That is good.
Do that
First-hand
right now.
experience.